Chapter 4. A Proper Teacher. I had finally decided to become a proper teacher. No more supply work or temporary posts. I wanted to see if I could really do it, teaching my own subject, history. Besides, the government was about to insist that all new teachers had the postgraduate certificate of education as well as a degree. There was just time for me to get a permanent post without having to go back to college. I was therefore glad to accept a post as history teacher at Camden School for Girls in North London. Here were gathered the daughters of North London's intellectual elite. Their parents worked not in shops and factories, but for the BBC, the New Statesman, and the Guardian. They wrote plays, pithy articles, and historical documentaries for television. Their weapons were words, and their daughters came to school fully armed with the ammunition they had acquired at the breakfast table. The first target to present itself after breakfast was the teacher. The girls and their parents regarded teachers as little better than servants who happened to be paid by the government. Why would you be a teacher when clearly, if you had any brains or ambition, you would be on the editorial staff of the Guardian or a Labour MP like Daddy? If the girls were going to achieve the standards their parents had set for them, their first task was to demonstrate their intellectual superiority over their teachers. It was 9:15 a.m. and I was facing my A-level group. I had a slightly thick head. The previous night I had stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning. I had marked 35 eight-sided essays on the causes of the First World War before attempting to prepare the lesson for the sixth form group that I was now facing. "Mr. Baldwin," said Persephone, "did you read my uncle's article on Elizabethan eclecticism in the Modern History Journal?" "No, Persephone, I didn't know he'd written one. Who is your uncle?" "Professor of Early Modern History at King's. Well, he argues that nationalism in Elizabethan England was an ephemera, designed by the autocracy in order to replace vanishing feudal obligations with an ersatz set of allegiances to a neo-tribal concept." "No, Persephone, I haven't actually read it. Perhaps you could get a copy for me and we'll discuss it later." "Well, I don't see how you can teach Elizabethan history without first reading Professor Liebstein's work. So," she said, with a sigh of disgust, "I suppose I'll have to try and get you a copy." "Thank you, Persephone." In fact, I wasn't a very knowledgeable teacher. I had never previously studied the Elizabethan period and was struggling with the basic texts. Persephone and her friends could already spot my weaknesses. With the patience of hyenas waiting for a wounded wildebeest to collapse, they noted my embarrassment and nodded to each other. When parents' evening came, they would surely move in for the kill. I found myself working later and later at night. The pile of students' work waiting to be marked rose higher and higher. Whenever I set my O-level classes an essay, I would get back 35 scripts, each one the length of a minor PhD thesis. Even the 11-year-olds would produce verbose little 3-sided essays on the Battle of Hastings. I had the misfortune to teach 70 of these children. I used to have a hobby, jazz. I tried taking the marking with me to Ronnie Scott's club. I tried marking essays on the bus, in the bath, during supper, on the lavatory. It was killing me. I reflected that I only got the job because my predecessor had retired with illness at the end of the previous term. In fact, she had had a nervous breakdown. I had met her briefly after my interview. She was shaking as she explained the type of work I would have to do. At one point she burst into tears, but pulled herself together. Of course she must be a neurotic, I thought arrogantly to myself. She told me she was a doctor of philosophy. Well then, she must be too high-powered for school children. Now, I was going the same way. Only I didn't have a PhD to wave at people when the going got tough. Something had to be done, and soon. I introduced 2 new ideas into my marking regime. A. Self-appraisal. Speak to the class firmly as follows. Now, I want you to take 10 minutes to read through your work. Be very critical. Then give yourselves a mark out of 10. B. Colleague appraisal. Maintain firmness of speech. Would you please exchange your papers with those of your neighbour and, still being very critical, give them a mark out of 10? C. Collective appraisal. Collect in the marked work, take an average of the 2 marks and hand it back the following day, reading out the marks with sharp intakes of breath at appropriate points. This system covers all bases. Sadly, in recent times, ministers for education, either out of ignorance or spite, or both, have applied this system to teachers themselves. The result has been a collapse in morale, leading to drastic staff shortages. None of the girls ever complained thereafter that they had been unfairly marked. They took a ghoulish delight in being critical of their best friend's work. Best of all, the whole process took up at least 25 minutes of the lesson, allowing me to regroup and prepare myself for the next batch of 35 overheated adolescents. After school, I got to eat, went to the lavatory, and occasionally went to Ronnie Scott's, without taking a pile of marking with me. Well, it was them or me, and they didn't really need teaching. Of my 10 A-level students, all got A or B grades, and 4 got scholarships to Oxford or Cambridge. As I write this, 30 years later, I expect they are running the BBC or they are ministers in Tony Blair's cabinet, unless, of course, they collapsed years before in a heap of self-doubt, in which case they will be running organic food shops in Stoke Newington. For these children had to live up to a great deal. It is not easy having a father who challenges government policy in a loud voice on the telly every night, or a mother who is principal soloist for the London Philharmonic Orchestra. I came across problems and diseases at this school that I'd never previously encountered. Drug abuse, anorexia, bulimia, depression, migraine, and a general inclination to make life far more difficult than it otherwise need have been. There were girls who deliberately left their comfortable 4-bedroom homes in leafy Hampstead to go and share a dirty squat in darkest Kentish town. Posh accents were dropped in favour of mock Cockney. Torn and dirty jeans were de rigueur, as were mannerisms such as spitting, sniffing loudly, bum scratching, and rolling your own fags. It seemed as if the girls were trying to prove that Daddy was really a workman on a building site, hanging the waist of his trousers low and whistling at the girls going by. At that time, I read a number of articles by worried journalists in the Sunday papers about teenage girls who were causing concern. The girls were all from Camden School, and the journalists were their mothers. I would meet the mothers and some of the fathers at parents' evening. When it was the time to meet the parents of my 2 first-year classes, I found to my horror that all 70 sets of parents had turned up. I had to give individual attention to all 140 of them in 90 minutes. By 9:30 p.m. I had been harangued, bullied and intimidated by BBC interviewers, Labour Party politicians, lawyers, famous historians, playwrights and philosophers. I'd had enough. I told the 30 parents who remained queuing up to see me to go away. "Your daughters will all get to university," I said. "I'm going home." A few weeks later, at the 5th year parents' evening, it was the girls who were allowed by their approving parents to lead the onslaught against the hapless teacher. "Mr. Baldwin," some forthright 16-year-old will begin, "I really don't think you have a proper grasp of your subject. The delivery of your material is poor. And haven't you heard of visual aids?" I would defend myself to the best of my ability. This time the parents would withdraw their protégé only when they'd seen enough blood. "See how she's coming along, dear," I'm sure they were saying to themselves as they walked away. "What do you think of the Today programme for her after she's come down from Cambridge? Oh, look, there's Joan Bakewell. I'm sure she knows someone." Once in a while, there was a girl who wasn't affected by this competitive maelstrom. One such was Linda, who said, in a most encouraging way, "Don't worry about what the other girls are saying about you, Mr. Baldwin. I think you're a good teacher." I really wanted to give her a big hug, but that wouldn't have helped either of us. Which brings me, inevitably, I suppose, to the subject of sex. On the whole, for a male teacher in a girls' school, I would say that is not a good idea. Nevertheless, it's not something you can avoid. I found that I was not only the victim of intellectual attacks, but also sexual. The girls used sexuality as another weapon in their armoury. The aim was to reduce you not only to intellectual ruin, but also to physical and emotional rubble. "Mr. Baldwin?" "Yes, Ariadne. Is it important?" "Yes, Mr. Baldwin. Mr. Baldwin, I don't think you're gay at all, like everyone says you are. I think you're quite manly." "Thank you, Ariadne. Very kind of you, I'm sure." Fighting off a deep flush, I tried to ignore the giggles and tell them to get on with their work. This was a comparatively subtle ploy. There were more direct attacks. On another occasion, I was supervising a class of 16-year-olds who were quietly getting on with their work when I heard heaving gasps coming from the back of the room. Every time I looked up, the gasps stopped. After several rounds of this performance, which increased in intensity every time, I stood up and said to a red-faced girl, "Xanthi, have you got a problem?" "Oh no, Mr. Baldwin, it's just asthma. I think I'll be all right now. Thank you." "Well, please leave if it happens again." "Oh, it won't happen again," she purred. "At least, not for a little while." The class collectively suppressed their explosive mirth. "Right, you've got 5 minutes to finish your work. Now, get on with it." They did. Nevertheless, I had been stitched up and they knew it. As a male teacher in a girls' school, you are the object of love and disgust in about equal quantities. There were only 3 of us having to swim in this emotional whirlpool. The music teacher was an eccentric in his later years. That left Barry and me. Barry, I think, fared better than I. He seemed to relish the challenge. He was the son of a steel worker from Shepherd's Bush and had spent his formative years cruising the social events held by the young conservatives, looking for women who wanted a bit rough, as he put it. Barry was also academically gifted. He had achieved a distinction in his classics degree from London University. Now, here he was at a middle-class girls' school. He was adored for his academic ability and because he was the man that the girls so wanted their fathers to be like. He wore jeans and t-shirt in class, displaying labourer's muscles and a tattoo. He delivered his lessons in a strong West London accent. The girls would sit entranced. He was the object of left-wing female adoration. Here in front of them was that working-class icon that their Marxist-Leninist parents spent all day writing about. When Barry walked into his Latin class and stated, "You know, that fella Pliny was a bit of a wanker," his audience collapsed in helpless giggles. It was hard for Barry. Here was the fat boy in the larder, and the larder was very well stocked. Long after I left, I learnt that Barry had had a long and fruitful career at Camden School for Girls. He was a very successful teacher. For all I know, he's still there, getting sweet revenge on behalf of the industrial proletariat. Most of the rest of the staff were nervous, overworked women, weighed under by the pressure from those demanding parents and their neurotic children. They fretted, they sweated, they bit fingernails and ran nailless fingers through their greying hair in an effort to get it all done and avoid the criticism, the judgments, the gossip, the bitching. There was one woman who walked serenely along the corridors of the school. She exuded calm. Nothing seemed to upset her. She had been born and brought up in the Ukraine. Knowing this, and because I was teaching a class about the USSR in the 1930s, I asked her to give a talk about her life in the Soviet Union under Stalin. To rapt attention, she told the girls about the difficulties of surviving the 2 famines of the 1930s. She told how she had had to eat rats and shoe leather when she was a young girl like them. She told of the horrors she and her family endured when the Soviet army occupied the Ukraine in preparation for the German attack. She explained what it was like when the victorious German army advanced through her hometown, looting and murdering and pillaging as they went. By 1943, she told us, the Germans were retreating from the Russian advance, and as they moved west, they rounded up Ukrainians to work in labour camps back in Germany. The teacher talking to the girls had been force-marched from her home in the Ukraine to Bavaria. There she was made to work on a farm till the end of the war. At that point, she found herself in the United States zone of occupation. She had hoped, she said, to stay in the West. However, there had been a prisoner exchange in 1945, which resulted in her being put on a train back to the Ukraine. She returned to a devastated homeland. There were more famines. However, being an intelligent young woman, she was accepted into Moscow University to study English. As an honour for her academic success, she was presented to Joseph Stalin in person. She told us of her shock on discovering that he was nothing like the glamorous, virile figure portrayed in the posters. His skin was pockmarked and yellow, he was nearly bald, and he looked very old. She came to England on an exchange for one term as part of her course. She married an Englishman and stayed. And that was it, really, she concluded with a shrug. Everyone in the room knew they had been given a lesson they would never forget. Soon, I was feeling the need for something other than teaching these girls who didn't need a teacher. Reality was what I needed, a good dose of reality. I thought I'd become an actor. Meanwhile, and in my last month at Camden, the roof of the assembly hall fell in. It slipped off its supports and fell in one piece to the floor. The previous evening there had been 600 people gathered there for the end-of-year presentations. Fortunately, the only loss of life was that of one very squashed mouse. As a result, we had to transfer the whole school to the American school in St. John's Wood. There I experienced what it could be like to teach in an environment designed for teaching. It had fully carpeted floors and walls, glass blackboards and resource areas in the middle of circular teaching zones. Soundproofing was superb. Yes, that's right, soundproofing. And resources were abundant and accessible. Pupils could be taught in small groups, lectured to in larger groups, or they could work individually in subtly lit alcoves with electric sockets for tape recorders and other magical devices. No more echoing of shrill voices, no more scraping of 35 chairs on the floor when lessons started and finished, no more screeches made by chalk on ancient blackboards, no more begging for overhead projectors or tape recorders from the media resources officer, no more scrambling in dusty stock cupboards for chalk paper and exercise books. It was all there. It was pedagogical heaven. The students made incredible progress. So did I. I actually enjoyed teaching. I looked forward to coming to work every day. But it was an illusion. This was a wealthy private school, perhaps the wealthiest in London. It was an illusion for humble state school teachers, and pretty soon the dream faded. It was the end of the term. We couldn't use the American school anymore. If only, I thought. If only. It had already dawned on me that in every school in which I had taught, there had been a major disaster shortly before or shortly after I had left. I'd already encountered arson, revolution, strikes, riots, murder, and the collapse of an assembly hall roof. Perhaps I should stop teaching for a while, either for my own good or for the good of education.